Creative Power, Chapter 3, Constructive Imagination. In constructive imagination, i.e. active constructive imagination, we find the elements of reproductive imagination, previously described, gathered up by the mind, its materials separated and classified, accepted or discarded according to determined values, and then deliberately and purposively employed toward the attainment of a definite end or aim. In these processes, not only in the imagination, but also the intellect and the will play their part, the activity thus being complex and the result that of coordinated mental power. Yet imagination is the main factor of the process, and the work is that of the imaginative mentality, the other mental powers merely being called in to assist. In order rightly to comprehend true constructive imagination, its nature, its powers, its possibilities, you must first of all perceive that while it employs the raw material of reproductive imagination in common with passive constructive imagination, yet its processes carry these materials to a higher plane of activity, there deliberately making selection of them, accepting and rejecting them according to ascertained value, and then weaving and combining them into new forms and shapes, new arrangements and adaptations, building new structure of fact from the crude materials furnished it. Man, by his constructive imagination, exercises his true creative power and thus becomes a true and real creator, the microcosm, manifesting the principles of the macrocosm. Let us now proceed to the consideration of the various steps or stages of the processes manifested by the constructive imagination. It will be well for you to become acquainted with the details of these processes, for they will be employed by you in your activities along these lines, and you should acquaint yourself thoroughly with the way the wheels go round. Dissociation. The process of dissociation is the preliminary stage of constructive imagination. Dissociation is the act of disuniting, separating, breaking up, or parting that which has previously existed in associated or united form or condition. Practically every image of memory or reproductive imagination is concrete, i.e. composed and made up of several parts or elements united in a single image. Association is the primary element in remembering experiences or in calling them into consciousness in reproductive imagination. Constructive imagination begins its work by first separating and tearing apart the associated elements or parts of the reproduced images. It finds it necessary to tear down the old image before it can form the new image by reassembling its parts in new forms, or by combining some of these parts with the parts of other images likewise broken up by dissociation. Constructive imagination without preliminary dissociation would be as impossible as the task set by the town council in the familiar tale which passed a resolution: 1, that a new town hall be built; 2, that the new town hall be constructed of the materials of the old town hall and on the site of the old building; but 3, that the old town hall be left standing and be occupied and used until the new town hall is completed. Dissociation of familiar images is often quite difficult of performance. It is not easy to dissociate the color of white from our image of a swan, yet black swans are found in Australia. It is difficult for a dweller in the tropics to dissociate the idea of fluidity from his images of water, but he has never seen ice or snow. It is difficult to dissociate the idea of cold weather, bare trees, etc., from our image of a December day, yet south of the equator, December is a midsummer month. It was difficult for the opponents of Columbus to dissociate the idea of flatness from the earth and to construct the image of men walking on the other side of the globe with their heads pointing downward. It is difficult to dissociate the idea of youth from your mental image of the person whom you have not seen for many, many years, yet the person actually exists as a middle-aged man. Reconstruction. The constructive imagination, having dissociated the elements of reproduced images, then proceeds to reconstruct these elements into new combinations and arrangements. This either by simply rearranging the elements of a particular image or else by combining certain of these elements with certain other elements of another dissociated image. The following are the more common forms of imaginative reconstruction. 1. Simple partition. You can construct a new imaginative image by simply parting some particular element of a reproduced image from its associated elements and then discarding the latter in the reconstruction. Thus, you can imagine a human hand writing a letter, but not attached to a body, or a mighty eye seeing all things yet not attached to a body, or a detached human head floating through space, or a headless horseman, or a tree without branches, or vice versa. In fact, you can easily form the mental image of anything parted and separated from its usual associated images. That is to say, you can form such a mental picture, though you may not really believe that any such thing does or can actually exist in that form and free from its natural associations. 2, variation in size. You can construct a new imaginative image or mental picture of a familiar image magnified to almost any size. You can easily imagine giants whose beards brush the clouds. Gulliver's Travels can be read by you and easily accompanied by your own illustrated images. The gigantic figures of ancient mythology are not beyond the powers of your imagination. Likewise, you have no trouble imagining a world 1,000 times larger than our own, with all the familiar objects of our world magnified in like proportion. Jack's marvelous beanstalk rising to the skies is an easy task for your lively imagination, particularly in childhood. In the same way, you can construct a new imaginative image or mental picture of a familiar image diminished almost to any size. Fairies, elves, gnomes, midgets, dwarfs, all are familiar to the eyes of your imagination. You can imagine an oak tree capable of being covered by a thimble. Gulliver's Travels can be illustrated by your own mental pictures of the Lilliputians. The mushroom throne and acorn coach of the fairies are quite easily imagined. Elephants as small as mice, whales as small as minnows, worlds as small as grains of mustard seed. And these are easily created by a lively imagination. The scientific imagination of today sees each item as a tiny solar system composed of revolving planets. Scientific fancy can easily picture each of these electronic planets as being inhabited and as being like our own planet in every way. Size is comparative to the imagination and may be varied at will. You can imagine objects as being as large as you please or as small without regard to objective reality. The laws of the imagination are very liberal in respect to size. 3, variation of position, form, and color. You can construct imaginative images or mental pictures of familiar objects changed in position, form, or color, or all of these combined without any difficulty. Here also the laws of imagination are very liberal. You can imagine the familiar object in almost any new position. Thus, you may place a mountain in the middle of a valley, place a prairie on a hillside, terrace a mountain into plains, plant a garden in a desert, recombine hills, valleys, streams, rocks in a fantastic manner, having no correspondence in nature. You can imagine men with their noses at the back of their heads, their arms or legs exchanging places, ears on their knees. In short, the imagination can vary the positions of objects or parts of objects at will. You can imagine new shapes for familiar animals, trees, features of the landscape. You can imagine willows as straight as a pine, or spruce trees with branches like those of an oak. You can imagine roses with triangular petals, cubic eggs, octagonal oranges, cows as fleet-footed as a gazelle, crows as graceful as hummingbirds, and rhinoceroses as soft-footed and sinuous as a cat. In short, the imagination can vary the forms of object or parts of objects at will. As a writer says, the forms of objects are as flexible in the hands of the imagination as the clay in the hands of the potter. You can imagine a green or red sky, blue fields of grain, red leaves on trees, white vegetation in the garden, black snow on the mountaintops. The imagination can vary the color of objects or parts of objects at will. As a writer says, the imagination can make the eye as dark as midnight or give it a heavenly hue, paint the evening sky with golden colors, and robe the summer landscape with all the splendors of autumn. Number 4, recombined images. You can construct imaginative images or mental pictures in which the separated elements of several dissociated things are combined in new arrangements. Thus, you can imagine the head and trunk of a man combined with the body of a horse. Here, you have created a centaur. You can imagine the body and head of a man combined with the horns, legs, and hoofs of a goat, the wings of a bat, the tail of an ox. Here, you have Satan. You can imagine the body of a goat combined with the head of a lion and the tail of a dragon. Here, you have the ancient Chimaera. You can imagine a monster with the body of a dog with 3 heads. Here you have Cerberus. You can imagine the head of a maiden, the body of a vulture, and the claws of the eagle. Here you have a harpy. You can imagine a woman with serpents serving her for locks of hair. Here you have Medusa. Mythology is rich in illustrations of this kind. The patient in delirium frequently sees pink elephants with bat wings, dragon tails, and eagle claws floating around the room. Our dreams sometimes acquaint us with similar monstrosities, where we have been unwise in choosing the elements of our late dinners. There is practically no limit to this exercise of the imagination. The possible combinations are almost infinite in variety. Number 5, idealization. You can construct imaginative images or mental pictures in which the actual images of experience are given a more perfect, more beautiful, or more nearly an ideal form. Thus, you can picture a perfect circle, though you have never found one in nature, a more beautiful woman than you have ever seen, a more perfectly formed horse than has ever been observed by you. The artist exercising this form of imagination often pictures that which nature seems to be striving to manifest. You can also imagine ideal events, pictures of dramatic beauty, also ideal characters representing the full development of qualities which are merely partially represented or even merely hinted at in real life. The poets, great prose writers, and the dramatists manifest this form of idealistic imagination. Homer, Virgil, Dickens, Thackeray, Scott, Milton, and above all, Shakespeare furnish us with typical illustrations. Shakespeare has created characters which seem even more real to us than many of the actual characters of our own experience. The great composers of music drew upon this phase of their imagination and have given us harmonies and melodies never heard in nature. Artists of all kinds depend upon this idealistic imagination for their inspiration. Then they attempt to express in outward form in painting, in sculpture, in poem, in drama, in story, in musical composition, that which they have formed first as mental images. Number 6, invention. You can also construct imaginative images or mental pictures of familiar objects adapted to new uses and ends, or of new objects adapted to familiar uses and ends. Thus, the inventor imagined electricity being adapted to the business of transmitting messages, running machinery, producing heat and light, etc. Likewise, he imagined sewing, washing, weaving, reaping, binding, plowing being performed by power machinery instead of by hand. The entire history of inventions is but the history of the employment of the inventive imagination. As we have previously stated, the process of man from savagery to civilization has been along the path of invention. Every tool, every instrument, every appliance of any kind, anything made by the hand of man in order to accomplish a new end or an old end in a new way is the result of the activities of his inventive imagination. Number 7, planning. You can construct imaginative images or mental pictures of the plans according to which you intend to proceed in your picture work. The general plans his battles, the architect plans his building, The businessman plans his campaign of manufacture, sale, or other work. The clearer and the more definite the plan, the truer will be the result, all being equal. The mechanic, if he be a good one, will plan out in his mind the work which he expects to perform with his hands. Every work of construction, building, or general action contemplated by man is planned and worked out in his imagination before it assumes material form. The subjective form must always precede the objective form. Number 8, induction. You can make constructive imaginative images or mental pictures of the probable causes of a number of particular events or happenings along the general lines of induction. The great triumphs of scientific induction have been made in this way. The scientist groups together the mental images of a number of events or happenings, seemingly operating under the same general law or from the same general causes, the latter being unknown. He then seeks to discover the missing law or cause, and in doing so, he sets into operation his inductive imagination. He makes scientific guesses in this way, and then proceeds to test out the several hypotheses so obtained. Many of the great discoveries of science relating to physical laws have been made clear with the assistance of this form of imagination. All or nearly all of the observed processes of constructive imagination will be found to fit into one or more of the above categories without undue strain. The list, however, is not intended to be exhaustive, but is rather merely suggested as a loose classification. Mechanical construction and purposive construction. Psychologists note a certain distinction between the different classes of the images of constructive imagination, i.e., of those imaginative images which do not represent with any reasonable degree of exactness any actual object of previous experience. This distinction proceeds according to the following classification. 1, images mechanically constructed, i.e., in which the images are combined merely by a purposeless or indefinite process of joining together or associating parts of different reproduced images or memories. As, for instance, where the head and trunk of a man are joined to the body of a horse and the image of a centaur is constructed, or where the body of a woman and the tail of a fish are joined to construct the image of a mermaid. 2, images definitely and purposively constructed according to a preconceived design and toward a definite end and purpose, as, for instance, where the different parts of a machine, a play, a picture, a musical composition, etc., are constructed as a mental image, particularly with the end of objective reproduction in view. In the first of the above mentioned cases, the imaginative construction is known as mechanical construction. In the second case, the imaginative construction is known as creative imaginative construction, i.e., as true constructive imagination. The first type proceeds practically without a definite plan and purpose and is more or less lacking in continuity. The second type proceeds with a more or less definite purpose and aim according to a more or less definite plan and with more or less manifestation of continuity. With the first type, we have but little to do in this connection. With the second type, however, we are vitally concerned in this instruction. Therefore, we shall now proceed to a further consideration of its distinctive characteristics. Elements of the constructive imagination. Halleck says the mechanical imagination joins dissociated parts without altering them. Such products are as inferior to those of the creative imagination as is a pile of bricks to a finished house. The pile of bricks, to be sure, is put together and composed of a number of particular bricks, and so is the finished house. But in the former, there is merely a haphazard throwing together, lacking plan, selection, and lack of purposive thought, while in the latter case, there is a definite purpose, a selection of material according to its fitness for that purpose. And finally, the employment of purposive thought directed to the end of the efficient construction of the building. The elements of true constructive imagination then are as follows. 1, definite purpose. 2, selection of materials according to the estimated value And 3, employment of purposive thought and logical reasoning based upon experience. It is an axiom of psychology that no particular class of mental faculties manifests activity without calling to its aid certain other classes of mental faculties. There is always present a coordination of mental powers in all mental activities. One phase of power, however, always assuming the dominant role for the time being. Accordingly, as might be expected, we find evidences of such coordination in the process of constructive imagination. You should acquaint yourself with the details of such coordinated activity, which we shall now present to your attention. Emotion and imagination. Emotional states such as strong feelings or interest play an important part in the processes of constructive imagination. The best psychologists hold that in the imaginative process, there must be present not only the fixed idea, but also the fixed feeling. Riebaud says, the emotional factor yields in importance to none other. It is the ferment without which no mental creation is possible. The influence of the emotional life is unlimited. It penetrates the entire field of creative invention with no restriction whatever. This is not a gratuitous assertion, but is, on the contrary, strictly justified by facts, and we are right in maintaining the following 2 propositions. Number 1, all forms of creative imagination imply elements of feeling. And 2, all emotional dispositions, whatever may influence the creative imagination. In the process of constructive imagination, we find that feeling and emotion act as follows. 1, as an incentive to creative activity, and 2, as a coloring agent, giving to the created product the shade or tint of itself. Some psychologists have sought to limit the influence of the emotional states to such forms of constructive imagination as are concerned with the production of works of art and beauty. They would deny such influence to those phases of constructive imagination which are concerned with the production and intellectual and mechanical inventive stages. But more careful investigators are fully convinced that even in the last mentioned phases of constructive imagination, the emotional element plays its part and manifests a decided influence. Some careful teachers have gone so far as to hold that the emotional element is the primal original factor in all invention, inasmuch as all invention presupposes a want, a craving, a tendency, an unsatisfied impulse, often even a state of gestation full of discomfort. This want, craving, often even a state of gestation and urging of the unsatisfied impulse produces an emotional state of seeking for relief, for a relief which is possible only by the delivery of the completed idea of the invention. The inventor always experiences the changing emotional states resulting from partial success, temporary setbacks and discouragements, and finally the supreme joy of achievement, often reaching the stage of actual exaltation, accompanying the actual delivery of the child of the brain. An authority on the subject says, I challenge anyone to produce a solitary example of invention wrought out of pure abstraction and freed from any factors of feeling. Human nature does not allow such a miracle. In cultivating and developing your power of constructive imagination, you will do well to begin by encouraging the emotional feeling which urges you toward creative invention. By stimulating and encouraging the feeling striving for creative expression, you are increasing the fire which generates the steam that runs the mental machinery of invention. Interest depends upon feeling, is indeed a phase of feeling. Interest is the mental force which directs the mind to the inventive tasks and which holds the attention upon it. Interest is aroused and maintained by fanning the flame of feeling. In the activities of the constructive imagination and of the will, emotional feeling is the first requisite, the first element to be aroused. Attention and imagination. As might be expected, we find that attention, concentrated attention, is also vitally involved in the process of the constructive imagination. Definite, voluntary, conscious mental activity of any kind or form requires the application of concentrated attention, the act of holding one pointed, the powers of consciousness, the fixed idea and the fixed feeling necessary in efficient constructive imagination are the results of concentrated attention. The following quotations from eminent authorities will serve to illustrate the principle now under consideration. Riebaud says, psychologists always adduce the same examples when they wish to illustrate, on the one hand, tenacious attention, and on the other, the developing labor without which creative work does not come to pass. Newton says, genius is only long patience. I keep the subject continually before me and wait until the first dawning opens slowly, little by little, into a clear light. If I have made any improvements in the sciences, it was owing more to patient attention than to any other talent. D'Alembert says, genius is always thinking of the thing. Kay says, possibly the most comprehensive definition of genius is the power of concentrating and prolonging the attention upon any one given subject. Grillparzer says, inspiration is a concentration of that which for the time being represents all the forces and capacities upon a single point. The reinforcement of the state of mind comes from the fact that its several powers, instead of spreading themselves over the whole world, are contained within the bounds of a single object. They touch one another and reciprocally help and reinforce each other. In that volume of the series entitled Perceptive Power, we have given the most approved scientific methods of cultivating and developing the faculty of voluntary attention. Once more, we wish to impress upon your mind the fact that the mind is a unity, not a mere aggregation of particular mental faculties. Each faculty is found to call upon and to make use of the special powers of the other faculties. Each mental process is formed to involve the elements of several faculties. The activities of the several faculties or groups of faculties are found to blend into each other in harmonious, effective coordination. In the consideration of any one special faculty or class of faculties, this important fact is often overlooked. Observation and imagination. You have seen that the constructive imagination depends upon the perceptive powers for its raw materials. Without a proper supply of these raw materials of perception and observation, the constructive imagination cannot proceed to continue and create those edifices of creative images which serve as the models or patterns of the subsequent materialization. Remember always that the constructive imagination cannot create something out of nothing. Without having first sown the field of memory with the seed of perception and observation, there can be raised no crop of constructive imagination. The child with 3 blocks is limited in his building operations. Give him 9 blocks and he will be able to effect many more combinations. This is just as true of the individual who wishes to employ effectively his constructive imagination. His limits are determined by the amount of perceptive material at his disposal. The Eskimo dwelling in the Arctic regions can never hope to create imaginative pictures of the things of the temperate or tropical zones unless by some chance he has gained a knowledge of the latter by means of books, pictures, or the descriptions of travelers. Even in that exceptional event, as Halleck says, he must interpret all that he reads in terms of the ancient shrubbery with which he is familiar, and his best imaginative picture of tropical foliage will be meager and dwarfed. You would do well to cultivate your powers of perception and observation in connection with your work of developing your powers of constructive imagination. Consult some good textbook on this subject. We feel justified in calling your attention in this connection to that book of this series entitled Perceptive Power. It will be found to contain practical instruction based upon the best scientific methods of cultivating, developing, and training the perceptive powers and the faculty of observation. We scarcely need to point out to you that a very large part of the mental processes of any and all kinds are performed wholly or in part on planes or levels of consciousness below the planes or levels of the ordinary consciousness. Modern psychology has so thoroughly demonstrated this fact that we need do no more than to mention it here. As might be expected, the processes of constructive imagination are performed to a great extent in this way. We might even say that the conscious performance of constructive imagination is limited to one, the initiatory stages in which the germ of the creative process is carefully considered in consciousness and the initial impulse is imparted to it, after which it is placed in the subconscious field for incubation. Two, the intermediate stages in which the partially incubated creation is raised to the plane of consciousness. They are to be examined by the conscious mentality, adjustments, adaptations, and suggestions of improvement added, after which the incomplete process is again relegated to the subconscious levels. And three, the last stage in which the practically completed creation is raised to the levels of consciousness for a final inspection. Here, the finishing touches are added and the work is completed. The greater part of the process, you will note, is performed on the subconscious levels or planes of the mind. Hofting says, the interweaving of the elements of the picture in the imagination takes place in a great measure below the threshold of consciousness, so that the image suddenly emerges in consciousness, complete in its broad outlines, the conscious result of an unconscious process. The above statement, however, should have contained the proviso that the subconscious processes referred to were performed only after and because the conscious mentality previously had been actively employed in earnest and concentrated consideration of the subject in question. The autobiographies and biographies of men of genius, great inventors, great scientists, and others actively employing constructive imagination are filled with illustrations of the workings of the subconscious faculties of the mind. These show conclusively the important part played by these below the surface mental activities in all creative and inventive thought. While the actions of the constructive imagination proceed more or less freely or even spontaneously and cannot properly be reduced to a mere mechanical form of procedure, nevertheless, there are certain general stages or steps of the process which are sufficiently determined and formed to be subject to classification. The following general classification is offered with the understanding that it is not rigid nor exclusive. It is merely an attempt to picture the several apparently separate steps or stages of a process which in reality is continuous rather than composed of separated parts. So number one, the germ stage. This is the stage of the first general thought concerning the nature of the thing sought to be created by the constructive imagination. A writer has stated it as the first thing coming to the mind as a possible solution of a problem which has been put to one, or has struck him by reason of his needs and requirements, or those of others, and which has assumed nebulous form by reason of his previous observations, studies, and researches. The energy of this germ is supplied by the desire feeling arising from the needs of the individual or those of others which are known to him and which represent obstacles to the efficient expression of his nature. This desired fuller expression may be in the direction of self-preservation, health, welfare, protection, or general comfort, or that of military or commercial supremacy or success, or that of sexual expression with its many secondary forms of manifestation. Again, it may be in the direction of mechanical invention and construction in response to the mechanical instinct, or that of artistic production, or that of social reforms and improvements. Likewise, it may be in the direction of knowledge of science or philosophy, or that of religious or theological interpretation or explanation, and all that pertains to these. In short, every form of desire, feeling, emotion, need, lack, or want, every frustrated purpose, every emotional state which tends to manifest in will action may supply the motor or energizing element in the germ of constructive imagination. Around this energizing element are loosely gathered the general ideas connected with the discovery and creation of that which will fill this want, satisfy this desire, comfort this feeling, fill this emotional void. The germ so constituted has been described by a writer as an embryonic, unstable, and uncoordinated manifestation of the creative imagination, a transition stage between passive reproduction and organized construction. Number two, the incubation stage. This is the stage in which the germ rests in the womb of the subconscious mentality. Here, the mind operates along the lines of both conscious and subconscious activity. The conscious mentality observes the new ideas to which the interested attention now is directed by reason of the demands of the incubating germ in the subconscious mental womb, and then passes them down to the subconscious plane. There to be absorbed, assimilated, and combined with the similar ideative material. The subconscious mentality searches the stores of memory for associated facts, ideas, and images, which may be combined with the material of the germ or embryonic image. Of this stage, a writer says, the incubation is often very long and painful, or again, even totally unconscious. Instinctively, as well as voluntarily, subconsciously as well as consciously, the mind brings together all the materials that it can gather. Another writer says, here is the germ, the principle of unity, the center of attraction, suggesting, exciting, and grouping the proper association of images in which it becomes enwrapped and organized into a structure or ensemble of means converging to a common end. Number three, the delivery stage. This is the stage in which the developed embryo, the evolved germ with its accumulated associated and related images grouped around it in logical order, is raised to the plane or level of consciousness and is born into the world of conscious thought and cognition. Here, the happy subconscious and conscious parents exclaim, unto us a child is born. As a writer says, when the latent subconscious work is sufficiently complete, the idea suddenly bursts forth. It may be at the end of a voluntary tension of mind, or it may be on the occasion of a chance remark, tearing the veil that hides the surmised image. The child of imagination, so born into the world of objectivity, must be carefully handled and provided for. It must be nursed until it is strong enough to adapt itself to its new environment. The imagination must be drawn upon, as the breasts of the mother are drawn upon for milk, in order to provide for the offspring. The young idea may perish if it is denied proper clothing and food. It must become gradually habituated to its new environment. Undue exposure to the winds of objectivity may weaken or even kill it. This is more than a mere figure of speech. It bears a close resemblance to actual facts of experience, as many inventors and parents of new ideas know to their sorrow.